Hi everyone, and welcome back. I'm Angela from Cake Angel, and we're here for this week's Sweet Ramblings. Hope everybody's doing well and you had a great weekend and a great long weekend. If you were in Canada, we had a holiday Monday yesterday. So I'm really excited for today's Sweet Ramblings. We're actually going to be going down a bit of a technical discussion today, and we're going to be talking about 3D printing. Now, this is something that a lot of cookiers have gotten into over the last 12 to 18 months, as people are deciding now that they'd like to start to print their own cookie cutters rather than buy them. And it's always interesting to have that ability to be able to make your own as well. So just going to make sure everything is set up here. I can see some people are starting to join us. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, let me know. And for today's chat, I'm actually going to be joined by Lucie from Lucie Bakes. She recently released her 3D printing class, and I think this is going to be a great resource for anyone that is thinking of trying 3D printing, especially as 3D printers are getting to be a little bit more reasonable these days. And obviously, if you are addicted to having cookie cutters, then making your own is a great way of saving some money too. So let me go ahead and see if we can get Lucie into the chat. So those of you that are here, let me know, have you tried 3D printing yet? Is this something that you're maybe interested in learning about as well? I see a few names in here I recognize that I know have 3D printers. So hopefully you've got lots of great questions for Lucie today as well. And it can be quite a daunting technology to learn because it's very different. So not only usually when you buy the printers do you have to put them together, which is a bit of a challenge, but also then it's learning all those different techs that are available for you to actually make your cutters. So Sweet Pea Treat says she prints almost every day. So how many printers do you have as well then? I'm always interested to hear about how everyone has their printers set up, and also what type of printer do you have. So we have a Creality Ender 3 Pro, which was quite an interesting one to put together. I must admit, it was almost a bit like an IKEA moment there, but thankfully my husband is really technical, so he was able to get that put together for us. But I think sometimes that's half of the challenge, and why some people struggle with 3D printing is because it's not always something that you can just buy straight out of the box. There she is. Oh, and Ender 3 as well. Yeah, they are very, very popular. So I think that seems to be the one that most cookiers get into because it's the one everybody seems to talk about, and then you can obviously get a lot of support from people too, their notes and how they make things. So hopefully this will work. Fingers crossed. Hey,
Hi,
good morning.
good morning.
How are you? Nice to see you. And I know it's very early for you, so thank you for joining me at the start of your day.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, it's 9. It's not early, but when you're self-employed, it can be early.
Right, and especially after a long weekend too, I find that sometimes my Tuesday, the start is
So
a little bit
exhausting.
ropey.
Yeah.
It's always interesting.
Yeah.
So we were just having a chat just before you connected about the types of 3D printers that people have. So I know that we're going to do quite a bit of a deep dive into that this morning. But first of all, do you just want to go ahead and introduce yourself and give a little bit of background about Lucie Bakes as well?
Sure. I'm Lucie from Lucie Bakes. It's just me. And I mostly specialize in decorated cookies, like particularly painted ones. Occasionally I'll venture into other types of baked goods. And yeah, and then a couple of years ago, my fiance bought me a 3D printer for Christmas, and that sort of started off my little 3D printed cookie cutter shop. And now I have like 13 3D printers. Yeah, and I mean, it's still like a smaller scale shop because it's just me who manages everything. But it's been really fun. And also like the 3D printers themselves, they can be really frustrating, but I think it's like a really good thing to learn also. Yeah, so it's really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was saying as well, I think part of the sort of hesitation that a lot of people have in using a 3D printer is that it's, for a lot of the brands, you have to make it yourself.
Yes. And which isn't actually the hardest part, in my opinion.
No.
No, if you...
No, I agree.
It does come, you know, like the ones that I have are, it's a really popular brand, the Creality Ender 3 Pro. It's like a well rated, really great value one. It's not super expensive. They're like, I think like 210 US dollars. I'm in Canada, so they're like 350 here. But it's a great value. You'd have to put that together yourself, but it comes with kind of IKEA like instructions on assembly, which the first time maybe you're putting them together, it's a little bit tricky, like any IKEA, you know, thing you're trying to put together, and you're identifying the different screw types. But if you can do it one time, then when you get more printers, it's much more easy to do it. Personally, I find the most difficult part, which I would never have been able to figure out on my own, is once you get the printer up and ready to run, like what do you even do at that point? Then what do you do? It doesn't come with instructions on creating your own files, or even what software you should be using to print the files.
That's so true. And I see that in a lot of the cookie forums, exactly what you say. Okay, I've got my printer.
Now what?
Now what?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they come usually with a little SD card with some test files on it that you can run. I think a cat is one of them, a boat. But there's no kind of what next. If, you know, it's not as simple as saying, okay, just go print and it prints. Well,
no, it's not.
What material do I need? What if it doesn't stick?
Yeah, what computer software? Like I think I use 3 completely different software programs to build one cookie cutter. So like, I don't even know. I mean, my fiance is an engineer, and he knew about these machines. So when I got one, I was like, oh great, like it's set up. Like now what do I do? And like I am a professional graphic designer. That's what I trained to do. So I have some good familiarity with Adobe Illustrator, like those programs. And he said, oh, okay, well, you need to do this file, and then you need to turn it into this file, and then you need to turn it into this file. So he sort of knew the programs that would be required, but I wouldn't know where I would have started if I didn't have someone to just point me in. And then what file, not even just the programs, but then what file type do you need to actually save your file as? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a foreign language when you start talking about SVGs and G codes, and
you're like, why? You know, which one's necessary? And like, and what order do they go in? Which one do you print with? People, you know, there's also a lot of people in the cookie community sell the STL files for their cookie cutters, which is great because if you have your own printer. But I think a lot of the time people then think, oh, I'll buy my own printer so I can print this STL. They buy the STL, but you can't print the STL.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's not just that. You need the STL, but you need to then slice it into the actual printed, like the printing with its printing instructions as the G code. And there's no instructions anywhere. Cookie people don't usually, you know, write that explicitly on the product description, because it's assuming you would know if you have a 3D printer.
That's right. There is a lot of sort of assumed knowledge, really, but it's, I find for a lot of cookies, it's so different to being creative. This is something very technical, but once you have those basic steps and the understanding of them, it's actually really rewarding, I find, to be able to make your own cookie cutter and say, oh, look, I made this. And it's obviously cheaper as well once you get past all those teething stages. But it can be frustrating because there's also then regular issues that may crop up. So we see a lot of people talking about leveling the bed, or the temperature, or even the filament that they use can be an issue. So what advice? I know you have a class that you recently released on all of this.
I do.
Did you want to touch on a bit of that?
I do. We did a live stream class. There's 2 separate classes. One is specifically on the 3D printer, building it. So it was a 3-day class. So there's 3 different, I guess, sections of it. The first one is I bought a 3D printer for the class, had it in the box, and then on camera, took it all apart, took out everything, and built it on camera step by step. You know, so that if the instructions they're not the clearest, then, you know, there's a video to follow along with exactly. and explaining why certain things go in certain areas. Then, in that same class, we then go over printing the STLs that sort of already exist on the SD file, like if you're running your test prints, leveling the bed, tricks to leveling the bed. There are printers you can get that come with self-leveling beds. They cost a little bit more. And again, whenever there's something like electrical involved or automated, there's more chance of something going wrong. So if you are able to learn how to level the bed yourself, personally, I just think that's a better option, because if you buy one that self-levels and then something goes wrong with the self-leveler, you're again in that same spot. And maybe if it's like electrically controlled, the self-leveler, and something breaks, then you might just have to actually replace a part straight out, and then it might cost you more in the end. Blah blah. Yeah, if you can learn to self-level the bed, it's really not that hard. There's just some certain tricks to it, and it does take a little while because you have to go to all the four corners of the bed over and over again. So I go over that. I go over issues with the 3D printer, like troubleshooting issues, like the filament stops extruding, or it's over extruding, or it shifts. And it comes with like a course document with links to all of these different websites that have like photo guides for diagnosing whatever issues, because I obviously, I can't show every single issue that could possibly happen on camera. So I provided some resources on different troubleshooting sites that I've used to help myself sort of figure everything out, that I found are the best resources. And then there's a second class, and that's specifically on designing your own cutters, what software is required, what order you need to do these things, and how to use each program. And then finally, there's some crossover with printing it and then making sure everything prints nicely and there's no problems, and then cleaning up your print. But yeah, so that's available. But again, if somebody doesn't want to buy it, that's totally fine. There are so many resources out there. It just does take a little bit more work to then piece everything together. So I really wanted to just put together an option that had everything that I'd learned in one place. So there we are.
I think that's really smart, because like you say, there are a lot of resources, but they tend to be one side of the coin. So they're either about making the printer or they're about making the cookie cutter, but you need that sort of, you need to have it together really, so that you can understand the whole process, because they're temperamental. I think they're not perfect, and they don't always run smoothly every time. And I know for us, when we went through the process of making it, and my husband mostly did that, I kind of just sat back and watched. But if you understand, like you say, why something goes in a certain place and what it's for, then it's a lot easier to troubleshoot when you do run into issues.
Because you go through a checklist of this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. They're all working now, so it should be working, or it could be this. And sometimes it's actually not the printer at all. I had an issue not too long ago where every single print was under extruding. It had these horrible, like, that awful, the gaps and everything in it. Just a very, very brittle cracking because it wasn't super strong. So there were all of these errors in it, and it was on a number of printers. There was like 4 printers that were doing this, and I literally for days sat there and basically was just crying as I was rebuilding every single printer from scratch over and over and over again, and I kept having the same issue. And finally, after a lot of deep diving on Reddit, I realized that it was actually the filament. I had bought some bad batch, and it was really full of moisture, and all of the symptoms of my prints were that. So I took all of those rolls of filament, popped them in the oven for 8 hours on like 150 degrees, like the lowest temperature setting an oven can possibly go. If you have a dehydrator, even better, because the lower the temperature, the better. Popped it in the oven for 8 hours, or left it overnight. And then the next day printed something, and it printed perfect. So there's a lot of things that could go wrong, and it's really hard to diagnose if you don't know exactly where to look. And I'd never had that happen before. So of course I go over that in my class as well, because I never would have guessed that.
Yeah, and a lot of it can do with the humidity in your house too. So if you live in, people in different parts of the world may have different experiences with that. So talking about filament then, There's obviously different types that are available, and we've always used PLA for ours.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of talk about the food safety of that. What's your opinion on 3D printing and food safety?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's really not black and white. There's actually a lot of gray area. Before I ever started a cookie cutter shop, I came across this and I was like, oh my God, like, what are people doing? Like, it's all poisonous, you know? So I did all of this research on what actually food safe means, and specifically with PLA. So generally, PLA is considered food safe across the board. But you can buy brands that are designated food safe, and the difference there usually is the colors and dyes that they've used in the filaments. Because colors and dyes, you know, if any like kids aren't supposed to have like number 5 red or whatever it is, or it makes them like ADHD. You know, those like urban legends. I'm not sure exactly if they're true, but there's that sort of what the dyes contain in the filament, because that's an additive. Does it affect the food safety? So what I read is that, I'm also in Canada, and the FDA and Health Canada and the, European different health organizations, the UK, they're all different and they all have different standards. So for example, if I was buying filament in the States and it was food safe and it contained a color that actually was not approved by Health Canada, it still wouldn't be food safe technically in Canada. So it's kind of your best judgment, I think, when it comes to PLA. I don't actually think you have to buy a brand that's food safe, because chances are they all are, whether or not they're actually labeled as food safe, they're all going to be food safe somewhere. And if exactly. Somewhere they're going to be food safe. Because that's just how colors and dyes work. Some organizations think it's food safe and some don't. And usually that difference is, I know specifically, for example, Truly Mad Plastics makes a super gold luster dust that I love and I use it all the time. And they say on their website, this is not a food safe product. It's not approved by the FDA. It's for decorating only, but lots of people eat it. Because what a waste to put it on a cookie and then throw out the cookie. And the difference there is that usually when something like that has to be approved for food safety, it means that it has to be food. You have to actually be able to metabolize it when you eat it. And that specifically, the TMP Gold, it's like a mica powder. You don't metabolize it. It basically goes in one end and out the other. There's no digestion involved. So that's why it can't be approved by the FDA, because it's not classified as food. You don't metabolize it. So there are some things I think that probably cross over with colors and dyes when it comes to food safety and PLA. If you're, looking at a specific website, some countries it might be harder to find food safe PLA altogether. I know I only recently just came across it in Canada. But any PLA, specifically if it's a neutral color like white, that's just food safe. Whether or not it says that titanium dioxide is the color white, it's food safe. Yeah, and then there are other things that can affect the food safety of 3D printers as well that people don't think about, that's not even related to the filament. But with the Creality Enders, they come with little brass nozzles, and brass is food safe. In most places, the fittings on our water pipes, plumbing in our houses, water that we drink from the taps, the fittings are all brass. So you would assume that, yes, of course, those are going to be food safe. But sometimes you don't know. With products that come from China, it may be the brass contains, trace particles of heavy metals, such as lead. And then that can leach into a cookie cutter as it prints through that brass nozzle. But you can really easily buy replacement nozzles in stainless steel, which of course are food safe. So you don't have to then buy like a really, really expensive printer that says this printer is food safe, because really the difference is the nozzle. And that's what it is. You can, yes, just go on Amazon, buy some stainless steel nozzles for the Creality printer. And then with the PLA, really it's just your best judgment on what you think based on, I do have a whole written section in my course packet on the food safety and colors and dyes, and how some countries it is approved, some it isn't. So really, you just never really know.
No,
You
that's
never
true.
really know. So you just use your best judgment. And also with, you know, like with a cookie cutter, if you are using a brass nozzle, the leaching only occurs when the nozzle actually starts to break down, because that's how the particles then physically move into the filament as it prints through. So if you're using brass nozzles, as long as you're changing them out regularly and you're not really beating them to death and they're getting all scraped up and super crusted over and everything, they'll stay in really good shape, which means they're not degrading and then not leaching into your cutters. And again, once it prints, you're not printing like a drinking glass where you're going to have water sitting in a glass that's then going to over time leach the ingredients from the PLA. So it's really just, it's, you know, a cookie. You just stamp the cookie and it's done. There's very little crossover time,
Exactly.
which is what really matters. So I wouldn't print a plate or a cup and then use those to eat regular meals off of. But when it comes to cookie cutters, the chances that you're gonna poison yourself with lead, oh, cat's here. The chances that you're gonna, you know, poison yourself with lead from using a PLA printed 3D, you know, cookie cutter from a brass nozzle where you're stamping a piece of dough and then you bake it, very, very, very low. Like the chances that you get lead contamination from rubbing like a brass key or a brass doorknob and then not washing your hands and like touching your face, probably higher chances there. So I think there is like some, I mean, not scare tactic, but some, you know, there's some hype over that because someone hears one little thing and it kind of gets a little bit blown out of proportion. But again, if it's something you're really concerned about, you can upgrade certain parts. You can make sure the filament you're getting is specifically labeled as food grade. And then, you know, if you're in the States and you're buying from a US supplier, it's been approved by the FDA. If you're in Canada, you want to make sure it's approved by Health Canada. And again, you can upgrade a printer, like a more affordable printer, to have a stainless steel nozzle. So again, you're still up in the safety there. So there's a bunch of little things that you can just look out for without having to spend $1,000 on a printer that says, we're a food safe printer.
And I think it comes up a lot because people say, well, surely the fact it's going through the nozzle and like you say, you just change it. But again, it's being baked and it's literally on the dough for seconds.
Seconds, yes. If there's the amount, like if you're looking at the size of that nozzle and the filament pushing through that nozzle, if there's any cross-contamination, it's a very little amount. And then a very little amount that the cutter is physically touching the cookie dough. There's like, you'd have a higher chance of poisoning by eating a can of tuna fish, honestly. So high in mercury. Like,
I agree. And
yes, like it's crazy what people, you know, are willing to put in their bodies, but then like, oh, you know, the brass nozzle, like you know, a full sugary can of Coke, like that's probably worse for you than cutting a cookie.
Yeah, sure. And I think
not
when I think back
with Coke, but you know, sugar can be seen as bad by a lot of people, but yeah.
And when I think back to, so I used to do cakes more before I sort of got into cookies, that there was a huge trend years and years ago about glitter on cakes, which again, like the TMP Gold, isn't strictly edible. You don't break it down, it just passes straight through you. So there are worse things that people use on their cookies than printing a 3D cookie cutter. Yeah. And I think a lot of companies, though, do kind of jump on that bandwagon as if we say it's food safe, we can charge.
Exactly. You can charge
and
more.
Then it kind of puts people's minds at rest, but it's not really necessary. I don't think it is. Cookie cutters printed this way. No, not at all. No.
Yeah.
So do you have any examples of cutters that you can show us?
I do. So this is a 2-part cutter. So it's a frame, so a rectangular frame, and there are 2 parts, so you can just use it as like a frame like this, or you can pop out just like the square in the middle if you want it to, you know, have like a backing or be see-through if you want it to melt ice malt in there. And then I also really love doing like, more elaborate designs like cutters and stamp sets. So like there's a truck. Yeah, so instead of it being like one, I know lots of people do, you know, one cutter where there's the cutter and the embosser. I like to have them as two separate pieces, so you can just use it as the cutter, and then, you know, just with your projector. Or you can also use the stamp, so then you just stamp the design on, and then your guidelines are there for when you're ready to use your royal icing and decorate. Yeah, and I do go over these in my classes as well, how to do more elaborate, like 2-part stamps, 2-part cutters. Got this one was a popular one for a really long time, like the Disney's castle. Yeah, and then additionally, like I go over how to add, like, you know, supports, so it doesn't, you know, it's not too bendy.
Yeah. Which they can be, because the filament is quite, so I have some too, and you can flex them. So sometimes you need that support just to, you know, especially when you're using a thicker dough as well, you just want to make sure that you can get a good sort of pressure on it. So I like the idea that you're doing the embossed ones too, because I've noticed there's a trend which has always been more popular, I think, in Europe, but now over this side of the world, fondant cookies are becoming more popular.
I know, it's funny. I've never done fondant cookies, maybe just like, you know, in small elements. Yeah, so it's totally a thing. You could do like embossed fondant, stick it on a cookie, and then be like, paint your own. Just white fondant, you paint it. Lines are already there. Like, it's such a good thing to sell without, like, you know, limited work. Not decorating everyone. I use my embossers straight on the cookie dough when it's raw, and then when it bakes, you know, the lines are still there, so I know exactly where to pipe my royal icing because all my guidelines are there. So there are like a number of ways that you can use embossers.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think as the fondant trend starts to take off here now, we'll probably see a lot more of that style of decorating coming out. So what would you say, from all the cookie cutters that you sell, what's the most popular shapes that you sell?
Ooh, I'm just looking over at them right now. I mean, honestly, I would say the wine bottles. I have 3 different wine bottles. So there's this one, which is like a champagne bottle with the open, like the foil kind of torn to the side, and then just a straight wine bottle, and then like a one that's popping. So there's like a big splash coming out of the top. I think the wine bottles are the most popular ones that I sell, funnily enough. And it's because they're large, like they're life-size wine bottles. They're large cookie cutters. Sorry, she's a guest here. She'll just continue to yell. But yeah, the wine bottles are really, really popular. They're also so versatile. You could do them for any occasion. Have a wine bottle cookie.
Yeah, absolutely. And as that centerpiece for other cookies in a set as well. Do you take custom cookie cutter orders?
Not anymore. I used to take them, but sort of at the beginning of this year, when I was doing just cookie cutters, like a cookie cutter shop, decorating supplies. And then last year I introduced live stream classes. So I was doing a lot of live stream classes. And then I was also still taking on some custom cookie orders. And sort of by the beginning of this year, I just felt so overworked. I had to let something go. And the custom cookies was, you know, the least money-making thing that I was doing. So naturally it was that, which is great. Sometimes you know, there are a lot of pros and cons to doing custom cookie orders. Like, it's really nice having somebody be like, do this. And it's an idea that I never would have done on my own. So sometimes I find like I get creatively stunted if I don't have somebody telling me what to make. But yeah, I'm not taking them on anymore just because I'm trying to focus on like the other aspects. And, you know, there's a broader reach with live stream classes and cookie cutters than just taking on orders. But yeah, I still do, you know, sets for my family members and for fun whenever I get a chance.
We've had a couple of questions come in. So Kristen has asked, what do you think is the biggest learning curve? Which we touched slightly, but if you wanted to do just go through that.
Sure.
So the biggest learning curve when you first get your printer.
I would say I've used Adobe Illustrator for years. So if you're going through my class, I do go all over Adobe Illustrator. So I would say that probably the software side of it is maybe the sharpest learning curve. Learning how to, draw your designs and then convert them into the 3D STLs was maybe the toughest part for somebody who's never used these programs before. But once you get the hang of that, it's all the same process for every cookie cutter. So if you can learn those programs, it becomes quite like second nature to me at this point. But other than that, the sharpest learning curve is the troubleshooting on the printers. It's the sharpest and the most painful learning curve of them all, which is why, in my course, I did link to several online guides that show it's basically there's these web pages that have a grid, and the grid is all of these different photos of all of these different errors, and you just click on the one that looks like your error and it gives you suggestions. So yeah, there are literally endless things that can go wrong. So that's probably, in my opinion, the hardest thing to learn, is how to diagnose and actually fix everything that can and definitely does go wrong. And the thing is also with some printers out there that are really expensive, like you could buy $1,000, $1,200 printer, you're going to have the exact same problems as a printer that costs $300.
That's so true.
Because it's the same. They're all the FDM printers, they're all going to have the same mechanical, electrical problems as each other. There's going to be clogging, there's going to be under extrusion.
Do you find that, because you have so many printers now, do you have to do a lot of maintenance on them? Yes. Or is it just general tweaks that you do?
Sometimes I'll go a week with all of them running smoothly, but it's quite rare that a day goes by where I don't have to fix at least one. And that's simply because there are so many. Obviously, the more troubleshooting there's going to be, because one will, crap out, the next one will crap out. But some days are worse than others. Some it's just a matter of cleaning out a clog. Other days I have to pull the whole thing apart.
Yeah, and like you say, once you get used to recognizing what the issue is, then the troubleshooting becomes a lot easier.
It's still a drag physically having to do it, but it's not a huge strain on my resources of having to go and figure out and research what's going wrong. I just sort of know what to replace, and then I just do it.
So as a ballpark figure for those that are watching that maybe haven't gone down the 3D printer route yet, how much would you roughly say an average, say 4-inch cookie cutter costs to make?
It depends on maybe the brand of PLA you're going with. The rolls are not super expensive, but they can range in price from $23 to $45. So if you're just getting a roll of filament off Amazon and it's $25, just a small cookie cutter is honestly, it's probably going to cost you 10 cents in filament, 10, 25 cents, very low. I mean, I think I print a lot of, ones that are huge, this is big. The stamps use a lot of filament. So that, in materials, it costs more. But if you're just doing 4x4, just a simple cutter, 4x4, you could probably easily print 100 of those with a $24 roll of filament, which is great. It means small businesses, you can keep your costs relatively low because the materials aren't expensive. Really, what you're paying for, I guess, is in time that it takes. Yeah, it's all time. So this truck may be 50 cents worth of material, but it took 12 hours to print, and that's 12 hours that one printer is completely monopolized. And that's, again, the printers use relatively low electricity. It's about the same as running a TV. So it's 5 cents an hour in electricity. But again, it's the time that's really valuable that if you lose, if let's say I'm 10 hours into a print, I run out of filament and don't notice, or something goes wrong, it stops under extruding, that's 10 hours of a printer down the drain. It's all in the time where the value is for printing them, just because they do take quite a while, but the materials themselves, very affordable.
And I think that's something often I'll see when there are a lot of 3D printer shops that have cropped up now over the last 12 months. And time is the one thing that they seem to get a lot of questions from their customers on, because perhaps if you haven't printed something yourself, you don't realize that this isn't a 10-minute print. It's going to take significant hours to print something. And again, if it goes wrong, you have to start again. There's no way to fix something that goes wrong mid-print usually.
Yeah, it just goes in the garbage. And then again, not a huge waste of materials. Like if a print goes wrong and I throw out a whole cutter, and it's not a huge waste of filament, but it's the loss of time. Because if you have all of these orders come through, if you open a cookie cutter shop and you maybe only have 2 printers, and it's a small scale shop, but you have, let's say, 10 orders, and they all have several cutters, you know, the processing time for actually shipping those orders out is dependent on how fast you can get your printers to pump out those designs, which would be hours. Even for, you know, an order with 5 basic cookie cutters, you're probably looking at 5 hours worth of print time. And then if something goes wrong, then you're starting again. So the reason I have so many printers is because I try to keep my processing time as low as possible. But yeah, if you don't have enough and you have like an excess of orders come in, it can often, jack the processing time up a lot, which I think can be really frustrating for people who don't realize exactly why it takes so long to get an order ready.
Yeah, and I think something like this conversation today is useful to kind of just put more of a reality on printing the cutters, because it isn't the case of going to Amazon and just ordering something and it turns up 2 days later. That just doesn't happen.
No, Amazon really ruined people's standards.
Yes,
their expectations. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, so we have another question.
Yes.
Another question from Lisa Nettles. Can you use these with marshmallow fondant?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, my response is yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. I only use marshmallow fondant because it's so delicious.
Me as well. it tastes so different. So we have another one from Dragon Lily. There are so many different 3D printers and I don't know which one is good. Any recommendations?
Personally, I recommend the Creality Ender 3 Pro. I only recommend that one because that's the only one I have. So I don't know any different. My fiance bought the Creality Ender 3 for me for Christmas. He's an engineer, so he knows about these things. He does a lot of similar things. So he's the one who did the research in at the time to figure out which one was the best, for my needs. And I've never had an issue with them since, as the machines, I find they're really reliable. They're great. So personally, that's what I recommend for 3D printing is the Creality Ender 3 Pro. And I recommend the 3 the 3 Pro as opposed to like the 10, because it's a smaller model. And I find with the larger, like the physically larger print beds, there's more chance of the level being a little bit off. And again, you can load your print. If you have a huge print bed, you can load it with like 1 million cookie cutters. But again, if something goes wrong, then you've lost all of those printers plus additional time, because the more cookie cutters are added, the more time it's going to take. So I actually tend to I have all of the smaller models, the Creality Ender 3 Pro. It's a small bed. I usually only print, up to 3 cookie cutters at a time. And that way, in the grand scope of things, they print faster than printing 6 cookie cutters because there's only 3. The beds are easier to level. They physically take up less space. And yeah, I find it's perfectly acceptable. You don't need a huge, massive printer. The small ones work just as well. If not, I have a 10, which is a huge build plate. And I also find that the replacement parts for the 10, the larger build plate, are also harder to find, which is really interesting. The Creality Ender 3 Pro, if I need to replace the magnetic build plate, they're all over Amazon, all of them. But I cannot find on Amazon anywhere a magnetic build plate for the 10. So I actually just use a build plate for the 3 on the 10 and only use that portion of the bed. The large,
That's
I know. The large, so like there are some other things to consider is if you're looking at other brands,
Yeah.
make sure that when you need to get replacement parts, you can actually get them easily. And the Creality Ender 3 Pro is so popular, you can get the replacement parts like anywhere, particularly Amazon, which is really important because if I'm printing something and something goes wrong and I don't have a replacement part and there's an order involved, I can get that part the next day. Because that's just how fast Amazon is. So that's why I recommend the Creality Ender 3 Pro, because of how easy it is to replace the parts. It doesn't take up much space. Yeah, and also they're a little bit cheaper, so why not just get a few more of the smaller ones? Yeah,
it's true. We just have the one, and it's literally just on a small table from IKEA, and it takes up really no space at all. I find it's not too noisy either, and I know that people are often worried about the noise. See, if you've got multiples, then there's going to be a little more noise. But if you just have one, you can literally just put it in the corner, let it do its thing. Do you tend to have yours going all the time, like 24/7?
Mine are usually going 24/7. They're not going right now just because they ran overnight and then they finished and I haven't started them up yet today. But yeah, they're mostly going 24/7. A few of them are kind of not working super well right now, so they've just been sitting while I just, eventually I'll get to fixing them up. But yeah, they're mostly running 24/7, which is also why they probably need maintenance all the time, is because they're just used so frequently. The more filament you pump through it, the more likely it's gonna, clog, and there's gonna be gunk buildup and everything. So it's
it's true.
It's how it is.
Yeah. So let's see, I think we covered all the questions so far. Keep throwing questions at us if you have anything. Devon has commented she wishes there is a way to recycle failed prints. And it is so frustrating when you go to your plate, especially if you just have one printer and you set it and then go off with your day and come back and there's a huge
mess
pile. It's terrible. And often you can't work out immediately then what actually caused that to happen, whether it's just it didn't stick properly or something wrong with the nozzle. So what would you say is the most frequent issue that you have to deal with? Is it the leveling?
Mine, I find that my biggest troubleshooting problem is under extrusion. So that's just when it just doesn't come out, like enough of it doesn't come out. So when I actually have a print that happened, let me just go grab it.
Okay, sure. That'll be good for everyone to see.
Okay, so this was a print that printed last night. Let's see if I can get it up. So you can see all of the edges are super, you can see here, like it's almost see-through. It's so brittle, and it's also like, because it's so brittle, it breaks really easily. So this is what happened last night. And again, I don't know why I literally just fixed up this printer yesterday. So clearly something's too tight, or something like maybe the little feeder is not tight enough, or something's going on there. But anyways, yeah, so I think personally under extrusion is my issue that happens all the time. And yeah, usually it has something to do with a clog, either in the hot end or the actual feeder itself maybe has worn down a bit, so the filament's not actually feeding properly. But yeah, under extrusion is my most common problem. And it's also probably one of the most frustrating ones to have.
Yeah, for sure. So Devon's asking as well, if you had a split cutting edge, what's the first thing you check?
If I had a split cutting edge, what do you mean by split? Like,
I think she might mean where you have the top of your cutter and maybe this bit so the bit that cuts the cookie.
Okay, so
I think that's what she means, yeah.
What's the first thing I check? Like if something failed during the print? Always, I usually just go through the same checklist of fixing things, kind of no matter what the issue is. There are certain things that I check. If it under extrudes in any shape, way, or form, any sign of under extrusion, I just go through the same. I check everything. I pull apart the hot end, make sure that there's no clog. Often I will just straight up replace the actual nozzle, because sometimes it's actually, there's a clog or burnt PLA in the nozzle itself. It's hard to clean that out. Check the hot end. Sometimes I replace the Bowden tube altogether. Sometimes Bowden tubes can also come slightly, like literally microscopically different widths, and that can actually sort of prevent the filament from feeding through it properly. So sometimes I'll replace the Bowden tube, and then I always also check the feeder. But yeah, also the with the thinner cutting edge, if you have a little split edge at the top, the thinner the cookie cutter is, probably the more likely you are to have some type of under extrusion error happen. I print my cookie cutters at 1 millimeter thick, but I know I've seen some people print them as like, you know, as thin as like 0.4 millimeters. And I don't know what printers they're using, because that's really thin.
That is.
And that's really thin. And the thing is with 3D printers, and maybe the Creality, just because it's a, you know, a lower cost model, it's not a $3,000 printer. Just the width of the nozzle, perhaps, maybe the smaller the width of the nozzle, the easier it is to print a tiny little cutter. But again, it's layers of plastic printed on top of each other. So the thinner that wall is, the more likely it is it's going to snap, because it is also just plastic.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes when we played around with the settings that we use, you want it as thin as you can get it.
Mm-hmm.
You get a really nice clean edge when you cut. But if it's too thin, then
it's just going to,
I mean, it's
just going to
too
break.
much, and it'll break.
And there,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there are ways of using a cookie cutter that has a slightly thicker edge to get a nice clean edge. All you got to do is press a little, give it a little, like press it down in your dough, give it a little wiggle, and that fixes the issue. I mean, really, the sharpest edge you're going to get is from a metal cookie cutter. That's the sharpest edge. One of the, you know, the bent aluminum cookie cutters, or stainless steel, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's just weighing up the differences between all the different types that you can buy, really, because you can obviously buy, I pulled out a few different ones that I have. So you can get the regular molded ones that Wilson would sell that are not 3D printed. And then, like you say, the metal ones, which you won't beat
you
this.
You can't beat that. But again, you're with the metal ones and the one, like those plastic ones that Wilton sells, like home businesses, you just can't make that. You just can't.
No.
The investment in, because the plastic ones, they're what are they called? They're the injected ones, in mold injected cookie cutters.
Yes.
That's like a $20,000 investment to make one design. And same with the metal ones. You have to have like essentially a mold to bend that metal around. So something's got to give.
That's right. Yeah. And I think especially as well, we give ourselves a hard time. If we're making them for ourselves, then they don't have to be as perfect as the metal alternatives. So, you know, it's obviously different if you're selling them, but most people, I think, that are starting to get into cookie cutters now are just doing it for themselves, for their own cookie business. Yeah. So you can let things go a little bit, I think, with that. So,
totally.
Yeah. So let's do a couple of quick fire questions. Sure. I do this every week with everyone that I talk to. So these are getting a little bit back to baking side of things. So in terms of what you prefer to make, so I took a look at your feed, and I think I know this. I think it's quite obvious, but let's ask anyway. So cake or cookies, which do you prefer?
Cookies.
Yeah. Have you ever done cake decorating at all?
I do. I dabble, for sure.
You do?
I do. I've made like my friend's wedding cake. I make cakes for mostly just not for orders, but just for people in my lives or special occasions. If something comes up, I like it, and I like practicing getting, you know, the buttercream super smooth. But really, I don't know what happens when I make a cake. My kitchen is a disaster afterwards, and maybe it's just because I'm less familiar with making cakes that I'm like, oh, a little more frazzled, and I'm not cleaning as I'm going. So when I'm making a cake, it's literally an explosion of mess. And when I'm making cookies, I'm just like, I've got the process so down packed that I clean as I go, and by the time the cookie's done, I'm like, oh, in a perfectly clean kitchen, and it's so much more pleasant. So that's a factor. But I like making cakes, but I would prefer to make cookies.
Yeah, for sure. And then in terms of your colors that you use, because you have a real variety, I find as well. Do you prefer to do pastel colors with your icing or bright colors?
Bright colors. Tend to
Yeah.
go with the bright colors, and I like to do a lot of painted details as well, and that just helps limit the number of colors I have to make in royal icing, which is nice. But yeah, I'd say overall, whether it's painted or icing, I like to go with the more vibrant colors than just a total pastel palette.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then when you do decorate, do you tend to do that in the daytime, or are you more of a nighttime decorator?
Daytime.
Yeah.
Usually, like by the time it's 8 p.m., if I still have work to do after 8, I just want to keep it to the couch on my computer. No late night decorating.
So where do you come up with your inspiration for the cookies that you make? Because you've got a fantastic selection of painted cookies. Is it things that you just see that you think, okay, that needs to be cookified, or where does it come from?
I guess a lot of the time, like, I mean, people sometimes will make suggestions, which I totally take, because again, it's nice to have someone tell me what to do if I'm like feeling low on ideas. But if there's something, going on in pop culture, like, Taylor Swift released her album and it was a huge like the re-recording of her album, and it was a huge thing. So I was like, oh, Taylor Swift, I'll do that. So sometimes things like that happen, which just like be like, I'll do something that's sort of topical. And a lot of seasonal things. I'm really looking forward to Halloween. Halloween is my favorite time to do decorated cookies for. I know I love Christmas a lot. I've been on Christmas Cookie Challenge. I love Christmas, but the Halloween cookies, like there is just so many possibilities.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and then I if I'm feeling like really low on inspiration, I often just search things on Pinterest, because there's so many like aesthetically pleasing ideas and like crafting things, and often something that's like a DIY craft, you can turn that into a cookie.
So out of the two things that we've talked about, 3D printing and painting on cookies, then if you had to choose one, which would you prefer to do?
Painting on cookies, just because the troubleshooting is not anywhere near.
No. It's less technical. There's less, I guess, less things that can go wrong as well.
Less sitting on the floor and like crying with all of these different Allen keys, being like, ugh.
So what is the one tip that you would have for cookies then in terms of getting into painting?
The brushes are really important. I mean, there's so many different things when it comes to cookie painting, but having the proper brushes is so important. I think if you don't have a background in painting, I'm so used to it by now. And I've been doing it for so long, but I know, like, if you're using a paintbrush that has a thicker end and you're trying to get a fine line, it's really hard to gauge how much pressure you should be like essentially applying. So if you have a super, super, super fine tip paintbrush, it actually makes it so much easier even for beginners to get like super fine detail lines instead of big, heavy, like black, you don't want to paint a big black wrinkle on someone's face because you're using a brush that's a little bit too thick. But having the proper brushes is probably the most critical supply, I would think. And then I always do my painted portraits. Like I color block the royal icing. So I do, instead of just flooding a cookie white and then painting from there like a canvas, that sort of gives you a lot more opportunity to make a mess if you're painting straight on a white background, because then you have to paint the skin color and then you're painting things over top of the skin and you can really muddy things up. But if you start with like a color blocking technique, like if you're doing a face and you flood the whole hair area, sort of the base color, if it's blonde, just like a pale yellow, the skin, the area of the face, you flood it with a pale skin color or whatever the person's, face is. I always go with sort of a mid-tone. If I was going to do myself, I'd go with something that's, if I had a photo of myself, I'd go with something that's not the brightest area of my face, but not the darkest shadow, somewhere right in the middle. And then you can add shadows with a slightly darker tone, and then add like a little bit of white gel for highlights on the face. But yeah, starting with a color blocking technique for painting cookies is also really important, because the less actual paint you have to add, the better it's going to look in the end, because you're not going to have all of these brush strokes all over the place, all over the skin and everything. I see someone asking some questions. Where do I get my brushes? So I get my brush. I have my own store with brushes in it. They're like rainbow quills. They're super, super fine tipped. They're like these rainbow paint brushes. They're kind of like a feather quill at the end. So instead of 3, they're super fine. I'm in Canada, so if you wanted to order from the States and just for faster shipping or whatever, Inspired to Taste also has the same brushes. Hers are just a mermaid tail, and they work so well. And then someone asks for black, do you prefer gels or edible charcoal? I often use a combination of both when I'm painting. Edible, like activated food grade charcoal, is so great for painting with, just because it doesn't bleed. Like, it's a powder base. Oh, wow. Yeah, it doesn't bleed. It's powder based, so when you add a little bit of liquid, when that liquid evaporates, it's just totally dry. Where if you've ever
makes sense.
Yeah, if you've ever painted or drawn on a cookie with like an edible ink pen, or painted with food gel, black food gel, and then you pop that cookie into a bag, the humidity will cause the bleed to leach a little bit. It doesn't happen with charcoal. So I do love charcoal if I'm finding like maybe it's not super deep or whatever, I need some additional like shading. I can even add black food gel to the charcoal. And that also, adding the charcoal to a little bit of black food gel, that charcoal like will absorb any excess liquid in the black food color. So again, less chance of bleed.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've never tried it myself, but it does make complete sense. And we're seeing a lot more dusts being used as well these days. So again, I think with the bagging and humidity and moisture, it helps to keep the color where it's supposed to be. Exactly. and as bright as it's supposed to be as well. Yeah, that's a great question. So you have obviously a lot of classes that you teach online as well. You pivoted to doing that. Did you ever teach in person before?
I've never taught in person. I only started doing the live stream classes sort of about a year ago. So it was like height of the pandemic. So nobody was going anywhere. I'd never taught classes before. And I just thought, oh, live stream classes, like I should give this a try. Everyone's doing it because nobody's leaving their house. And it was actually so much fun. I'm not sure if I'll do in-person classes just because I don't know where I would do them. Again, you're also limited to how many people can attend. I really like having like an unlimited capacity through live stream classes. It's so fun to have like a huge class and then everyone's chatting, and it's really has changed things, I think, in the cookie world, especially that suddenly you can take a class with someone the other side of the world from you. So it's amazing. And once that class is there, it's always there. Which is great too, because I've taught a lot of in-person classes and you get those questions afterwards. So okay, now I've gone home and I'm trying it, and I can't remember.
So I think that definitely live classes virtually now is it's a huge game changer for our industry. So what's next for you? What are you working on next?
Well, things are really slow just because it's the summer. So I've been trying to work on a lot more like digital stuff and then getting stuff prepped for fall. So right now I'm just sort of working behind the scenes on some live stream class ideas for the sort of back to school autumn season. And then I've got some other stuff planned for this fall winter that I'm also really excited about, but you have to stay tuned.
It's funny how all of the bakers I've talked to every week, everyone is so excited for Halloween this year.
Honestly, for the last month I've been like, I just want summer to be over. Because like it's in the summer business is slow, it's really hot, I'm not baking because it's too hot to do that, and I'm just like,
it's true. I find with me as well, I don't create as much content in the summer because there's so many other things to do. It's easier, especially for us when we have snow and it's a lot drier here, to come up with things then, because you're not dealing with all those humidity issues either. So Yeah, I'm always excited when summer's starting to come to an end. So
Me too.
yeah,
Can't wait.
well, that's good. Any last tips then for anyone that is thinking of taking the plunge into 3D cookie
Um,
cutter?
I'm not sure, but if somebody has like a question, because I do have a class, and they're on the
Mm-hmm.
more expensive side for the both classes. I mean, it's like 15 hours of class time for it's like $150 for that. But that's still that's a considerable amount of money. So if somebody has questions about the classes and what's included, if they need to know, like I'm all open, happy to help if somebody has follow-up questions about it before they buy it, or if they just have some general questions. Always happy
I
to
think I think
go
this has
through that.
covered a lot as well, just kind of demystifying that it is achievable. You don't have to have a tech background to do
No,
it.
you really don't. You just need to be willing to learn. Yeah.
And I think patience too, a lot of the issues are that we're so used to buying something and it's ready to go from the
Mm-hmm.
box. But you just have to, learn the tech a little bit more with this. And then once you're up and running, I think the cost saving, it's worth the time and effort to
Yeah.
learn it.
And
For sure.
and there are other things that you can also print. Like you don't have to buy a 3D printer to just print cookie cutters. You can print cake toppers and molds for making your own, silicone molds. You can create it. You can 3D print a cast.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's
that's
so many
true.
possibilities.
Yeah, yeah. And especially again with the price saving then. I know we've printed really sort of quite random things for around the house as well, like little coasters
Yeah.
and a little birdhouse that my kids had us
Like you
print.
can print like
So
light switch covers. Like there's
yeah,
everything.
it's and there's so many websites out there with the files ready for
Mm-hmm.
you to try this stuff too if
Yes.
you're not at the stage of actually designing them
Exactly.
yourselves. So many options. So this was really, really great though.
Yeah, this is
It's
so
really nice to talk
fun.
to you. Yeah. And good to have a nice chat about 3D printing because I think the more we can encourage people to try and learn these other skills, then it's going to be great, especially if they have a business and they're
Yeah.
selling cookies as well. Just to keep their costs down in the long run, I think it doesn't take long for the printer to pay itself back, really, once you're
Not at all.
using this. Yeah. Oh, we have one last question. So, what are some websites
Oh, I think
are you using for
for
cutters? I think
where to
maybe.
find STLs. Um, let's see. I know if you know what, honestly, Etsy is a great place to start for STL files for cutters. Like all you got to do is type in cookie cutter STL or like angel cookie cutter STL. Keywords STL, always use that.
Yeah.
So Etsy, great site. I have my STLs. You can buy the STLs like for all my cutters. You can buy most of them I have on my website now. A lot of other cookiers who have stores also sell STLs. And they're saying not cutters. So if you want other things, you can try again Etsy. Lots of 3D models. Like you could type in anything and go for type in STL. Light switch cover STL. 3D printable teacup STL. And Thingiverse. I'm not sure how to type it, but yeah, Thingiverse. There, someone just said is good for random non-cutter stuff.
Yes, very random things on there.
But if you also just type into Google like free STLs, you'll probably get a whole bunch of hits with a whole bunch of random stuff.
And do you just want to give a recap of where everyone can find your classes and your STLs as well, your website address?
Yeah, so my website is luciebakes.com, so LucieBakes bakes.com. And again, I'm sure there's a way they can see my handle on this live stream, right? So you can also find it through the link in my bio on Instagram.
Yeah, so when we finish the call, this will actually be posted onto IGTV as well. So I'll tag you in the post. Great. And then everyone can find you that way as well. So yeah, this is great. Thank you so much. I think we've answered a lot of good questions that came up as well. So hopefully some people will feel inspired to go down the 3D printing route and they can your account and ask you some of the questions about your classes as well.
Yeah, and I try to respond to all my DMs. So if somebody DMs me a question about 3D printing or my class or whatever, happy to answer it. The only DMs I usually don't answer are the ones that are where there's not a question.
Yeah.
It's just a random, like a weird message of some kind. But other than that, I always answer my DMs.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of those lately.
Yes.
I get those. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's great. So thanks to everyone that's joined us today and those that watch the replay as well. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Marta Torres, who is a cookier in Portugal. So she's known for doing dimensional piping. So that's going to be great. She's going to show us all the different techniques that she uses for that. And thanks again for watching. So thanks for joining me, Lucy, as well.
Thanks for having me.
And I'll see everybody next week. Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye.